said it basically lived and died by just all the data research. Google being a very data-centric company, he had to fight and battle depending on, they did user tests of, let's put up 42 different colors of blue and let the person decide what the blue needs to be. Well, he couldn't take that, or had a battle on if it needs to be 1 pixel or 2 pixel lines and stuff. So in the article, I had quite a few different people talk about user experience and research and what that means. And one of the best, I pulled out some of the best quotes here from some of these people from these design institutes. First, when customers sometimes don't know what they know, or what they want, I'm sorry, I would replace that with customers most of the time don't know what they want. Because I've been to numerous on-site clients, and that's the hard thing, is trying to get the correct information you're looking for. Because a lot of times they're going to ask for information, or they're going to tell you what they want. Usually the person you're talking to, your client, is not the user of their software. Probably 80% to 90% of the time. Unless it's an internal app and you have employees you can work with. So you're usually talking to the wrong person most times. So you actually have to do a lot of these user interviews. We'll get to them next. And again, it's also dangerous to listen to the actual users, because they really are just going to comment on what they want, but they're not going to tell you exactly what they really want to do. And I'll get into more of that as well. Another good point here is with Deborah Dunn. She actually says you actually get more information from engaging with the users, and that way it allows you to gather as much information as possible from the actual users using the application, or an existing application, or a new application using you're testing with. And that's where you make the big leaps of design. You just don't take information from the clients or stakeholders or marketing people and stuff like that, and then apply that just as what they said. And so what this rolls down to is really, I mean, getting like web stats for, like, say, a financial institution. You know that probably the main site or main page that is hit on a financial institution site is the accounts page. Everybody wants to see their account, wants to see it, but you really don't know. You may know that a lot of people go to the accounts page, but you really don't know what on the page they're doing. So user stats are great and they're important to help. It's just a piece of the pie that you're going to try to figure out. But down there it says at the bottom is, us as designers, user experience people, we try to take all the information and go to a deeper level where we add all that information up, and we try to help identify what those real goals are going to be for the end user. So, excuse me 1 second. So, I go on a lot of client calls a lot of times, and I'll be one of the first people to go and interact with the client. So I'll go on site for, let's say, 3 or 4 days. And I'll do a lot of user interviews and research. I like to do a lot of research before I could go, but sometimes that's not really the case. But so one of the things I tell people when I kind of do user experience is I like to immerse myself as fast as possible in the culture of the user of the application. And that could be plenty of different people. It could be the client you're talking with, or it could be your client's users, the end user. Or it could be the employees if you're building an enterprise application for internal use. But the key is to do it as fast as possible. And sometimes it's a little difficult. You've got to kind of remove everything that you've constantly learned about maybe an industry that you're going into. Sometimes you need to wrap yourself up. Like for the financial institution area, or for for investment brokers. I don't really know a lot about that industry, so I had to really research. I'm doing a current project on that now, so I do a lot of research on that. But what it allowed me to do is I just go in, I immerse myself as much as possible. And then another great thing is to create and understand user goals. And I'll get into more of the user side of things in the next slide here when we get into the personas. But creating and understanding user goals, so this is basically what we like to do sometimes, try to do all the time, is create this single sentence, or this like goal, I guess you could say, to define what you're trying to achieve from an application standpoint. So if you think about it, let's say we wanted to, an example would be, I have up here, iPhoto to an Aperture, and hopefully you guys kind of know those two applications. But basically, if you take a sentence like you wanted to create an easy-to-use image editing application for a novice photographer, that's basically like a good goal definition of if you're trying to target to build maybe an iPhoto application. So very user-friendly, very, very novice. Now, if you could change that sentence a little bit to say, I want to use or create an easy-to-use image editing application for the professional photographer, and that simply changes a little bit more maybe an Aperture, so it allows you to do a wide range of different things. So you have two different goals, but you actually come up with two similar but very different targeted applications. So by doing that, it gives you the mental knowledge to say, okay, whenever you're creating an application, you get into the mode of actually building some wireframes or building some steps to actually build the application, you always can revert back to the goal and try to define if what you're building really achieves the goal that you asked in the beginning. And that really helps narrow down a lot of people because they always start throwing in their own ideas. And I'll get to more things on that as well. User interviews and observation. This is great. When you go on site, you can really interact with people. And that's what I try to tell people as much as possible. Try to interact with the actual users of the application, because those are the real people that are using it. Some of the ways to do that is not only do user observations, but and sitting back, looking at people in an ethnographic world where you're watching them in their own environment. So you can see at their desk if they have sticky notes all over their computer, if they have stuff on their desk or piles of paper, what they're doing with those. You're trying to figure out from a process standpoint how you can improve that. But some of the good things to do is when you're asking questions to be able to pull information, because a lot of people don't like to really go on and on. Some people do, just taking it back. Sometimes you have to stop them, and there's ways to do that as well. But you want to ask these open-ended questions. So when you get in there, so say for instance you want to figure out, for example, I went into for this financial institutions company in their trading department, and they have 4 people in this group. And I went in and I asked some of these questions. So what makes a good day, what makes a bad day? And it'll tell you from the standpoint of their world in their office, not driving in, those traffic, not that extent, but kind of get their idea of what in your head you can start wrapping around what their day is like, immersing yourself. So then you ask, so what activities currently waste your time in this application? Let's say this was in a legacy application we're trying to improve upon. So you try to ask some of these questions, try to pull some of this information out, try to figure out, well, what type of workarounds do you do? What kind of shortcuts do you do? And they put, what are the sticky notes on your computer? Stuff like that. And then if you're doing more of a process-oriented type of thing, you can ask them, what were some of the first things you did today to try to figure out what the steps are that they do to accomplish their job. I had an interesting story when I was out there doing that trading interview with this trading company, in the trading department, I should say. There was 4 individuals in the room, and I kind of observed each one of them and asked them all some of these similar questions, wrote down some notes, and they allowed me to take some pictures of their desks so I could do some of the next steps you'll see in a second. But when I was asking these questions, I looked on the desk, and one of the individuals had an old-fashioned wooden ruler on their desk. I was like, why would there be an old ruler? So I stuck it in the back of my head, and before I left, I wanted to ask them. I was walking out of the room, and I said, well, one last question. I go, what's the wooden ruler on your desk for? And they kind of all giggled and laughed, and the gal that was on her desk, she goes, well, what I use it for is I have a long task of items I do every single day, and I have to make sure I do them in a particular order. She uses the ruler to basically make sure she follows her steps as she moves down. And that actually was very interesting. They kind of giggled about it, but that was really interesting to me that she would do that. And it happens to be this whole application is basically a process workflow application that's very task-oriented, task-based. It allows them to, step by step, make sure they have accomplished what they needed to do in that day. So it happens to be this one question I asked about this little ruler actually played very much in the entire process of how the application was built. So just kind of doing those things that, obviously they had the ruler there, they had sticky notes, asking those questions, you'll be able to figure out a lot about what they do in their world of process. So more of the research, and this goes back to the types of users you have. Obviously you have beginners, you have intermediates, and you have these experts. And I'm first going to break them down by not users of an application, but from a research standpoint. So when you're doing research, you have to actually, as we know, in this bell curve you see that what we call the potential intermediate user. That's your, the mass that you're trying to target. And obviously beginners are only beginners once. So when they use the application, they're no longer a beginner, depending on the complexity of the application. But they move and shift between, some of these areas. Same thing with experts. They may be an expert 1 week, but they may not use the application for a couple months. They go back to maybe intermediate because they don't know how to do everything at the expert level. Same thing with beginners. They bounce back and forth too. Everybody lives kind of in this area. So getting to that information and figuring out who that person is tremendously difficult, because when you do it from a research standpoint, the people you talk to from a client perspective, when you first walk into a client meeting, they want to tell you about their product, tell you about the legacy or what they want to do. You usually talk to sales and executives and marketing people to kind of get their idea of what it is. And those are really, when you think about it, those are the beginners, because when they go show the application, They're going to show it from a standpoint of showing it